Hi, my name is Carrie Wade. I'm the Director of Harm Reduction Policy at R Street Institute in Washington, D.C., and I do have slides. So I'll have two disclosures. One of my disclosures is that I swear I'm not a PR representative for RAND, which we'll hear a lot about today. The other is that I am a PR representative for the state of Minnesota.
Don't listen to her.
So I'll just introduce myself here because I know I'm kind of new to this field, and I like everybody to know how I got here. So this was my lab in this office up here at the University of Minnesota, where I worked on opioid pharmacology. After I did my postdoc in addiction research at Scripps in San Diego, I went to Johns Hopkins and did a master's in public health, and that's where I got involved in harm reduction. So I worked in a harm reduction clinic for opioid users distributing naloxone, and this picture is the 35W bridge, looking at the University of Minnesota up here, and it's lit purple for Prince's death when he died of a fentanyl overdose, and that happened while I was working at the Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition. So I'm here to talk about challenging bad literature for the good of public health, or rather, I was going to be here to talk about that, but instead I'm going to talk about Truth Decay, which is a report that came out about 2 months ago, and it was published by RAND, and it's to talk about the exploration of the diminishing role of facts and analysis in American public life. So Truth Decay is characterized by a set of 4 related trends: increasing disagreement about facts and analytical interpretation of data, blurring of the line between opinion and fact, the increasing relative volume and resulting influence of opinion, and declining trust in formerly respected sources of facts. I think that this this is meant to be a global report, but I think a lot of it can be applied to what's going on in the vapor industry. So the impact of Truth Decay is to increase stigma among people consumers of e-cigarettes and smokers as well. And we know that stigma is a huge barrier to people accessing harm reduction programs, and that's true in opioids, and it's also true in tobacco use. It also has impacts on stakeholders, so there's an increase in alienation of stakeholders between consumers, industry, public health experts, and it leads to ineffective policy and, of course, the erosion of civil discourse, which I think we're all pretty familiar with. So this is what RAND came up with in their study. Some of the causes of Truth Decay: cognitive processing and biases. In bold here I have serves to confirm pre-existing ideas, and these can be exploited by trusted sources of information such as researchers, government, and international community. I think that these two are really applicable to vapor. We have changes in the information system, so there's a shift between traditional media to social media, and this can promote disinformation. We have competing demands on the educational system, so people aren't there's a lack of critical thinking and social media literacy. And of course, there's a polarization between political polarization and socioeconomic polarization, which can cause and exacerbate Truth Decay. So I want to just say that none of these pictures of these slides or anything that I'm trying to point out is good or bad. It's just they're examples of what can go wrong, and how data can be misinterpreted, or how there are different interpretations between studies. So when we look at these, we can see a report on selected carcinogens and toxicants in vapor from electronic cigarettes, a report on particulate matter in e-vapor. See how flavors can affect metabolism, and how flavors can affect toxicity. And of course, the really scary case reports that happen of people who've been injured by e-cigarettes. So we can take all of these articles, and what's always missing is a comparison between these reduced risk products and combustibles. So it just highlights the different interpretations between what's going on here. When we talk about renormalization, there's studies that suggest that e-cigarettes are renormalizing combustible use. But then there's opposing viewpoints, which I happen to agree with more, that there's not a renormalization of smoking. When you look at Gateway, I think this, I know that this paper came out in December, and I think it created a lot of buzz that the trajectory is using path data, that adolescents who use e-cigarettes are 7 times more likely to use combustibles in the next year. Or we can look at these advertisements that people suggest are used to lure kids to e-cigarettes and then down the road combustible cigarettes. But of course, and I should point out that this graph is one of Clive Bates's graphs, so I want to give him credit for that. This, of course, what we see is the graph is his, but the data is from Monitoring the Future. So, this would be great, except the gateway theory would be great, except that we've just seen a rapid decline in adolescent smoking prevalence. So the other areas of truth decay, blurring the line between opinion and fact, what we just see is polarization, and polarization creates groupthink and just creates more animosity. The increasing relative volume and influence of opinion, we can see these changes from the 24-hour news cycle, use of Twitter, use of Facebook, and declining trust in formerly respected sources of factual information. I'm not here to suggest that University of Minnesota should be distrusted. I'm just putting it up there because I didn't want to throw anybody else under the bus, and I went there. Researchers, the government agencies, and advocacy groups like American Cancer Society. So what I think we see here is some of the consequences of this in the e-cigarette space is manipulation of data. So for example, failure to set temporal precedents in gateway studies leads to misinterpretation of gateway hypothesis. And a solution to this could be just increased fact-based dialogue, so keeping interpretations simple. I think that we have a lot of confusing and disparate messages among our group. People, you hear a lot of messages, amongst all of us who I assume all agree that e-cigarettes are a harm reduction tool. But we can talk about totally harmless versus less harmless. Nicotine is addictive, nicotine is not addictive. And, we can't really even agree on what addiction is. So I think that people within our field have completely different messages, and I'm not here to be like a negative Nancy about this, but, I think we need to focus on a singular message. And of course, we have increased discord among stakeholders. So for example, the World Conference on Tobacco or Health, industry partners were not allowed to attend, and so, they're excluded from the conversation in that particular instance. And I think, personally, I think that we do a pretty good job of having accountability and transparency, and much to Clive's irritation, I suggest that respectful dialogue might be one of the solutions. So this is kind of where it's left off, and I don't want to end on a negative note. The RAND study, or report that they have future goals, and some of these research questions are to look at the historical and international comparisons, data trends, mechanisms and processes, and solutions and responses. And so they actually invited people to, not specifically invited, it's just out there that if you're interested in this and you find this to be an interesting topic, they want engagement. So I would suggest that you look at that report. It's very interesting. Thank you.